brother, and welcome to the first of our lessons which will take us on a journey through the cards of the Major Arcana. In this lesson we're going to be looking at two cards, card 0, the card of the Fool, and card number 1, the card of the Magician. Okay, so let's start with the Fool at the beginning. This, as you can see, is the standard Rider-Waite Pamela Coleman Smith image, numbered 0. So a lot of people like to think of the Fool card as the beginning of the sequence. Then again, when you read Arthur Edward Waite's own book to go with this deck, he actually slots the Fool in between the penultimate and the last cards, between the Judgment card and the World card. In earlier decks still, this card has no number, so it's very much viewed as a wild card. But let's have a look what we've actually got in the image. What we see is a really lavishly dressed young man, basically on the edge of a cliff. You can see from this image, I mean, we're in a very high mountain range. In the background you can see snow-capped peaks. In one hand he holds a white rose, and in the other hand, supported on his shoulder, is what Waite describes as a magic wand bearing a satchel. So it's almost like, you know, he's carrying his luggage on the pole, but this pole is actually a magic wand. What else can we see? Very lavishly dressed, feathered cap. He has a dog with him. When you look at his posture, he's looking out into the sky. He's not looking at what's below him, and he's about to step off the cliff. The dog, as you can see, is almost barking in warning here, but he's paying no attention. The inference is, you know, he will step off the cliff without noticing. He's wrapped in his own thoughts, wrapped in his own joy. You know, the expression is one of joy. This is the card of taking the leap. It's the cards of beginnings. Now, if you think in terms of nature and in elemental terms, think of this as the Big Bang, the moment when the universe basically flashes into existence. It's not an accident that he's on the edge of an abyss. Basically, stepping into the abyss is stepping into a new beginning in figurative terms. There is a foolhardiness implied about this card. You know, there is also an innocence and a lust for experience, a joy for life. As the number 0, yeah, this represents total beginnings, from nothingness to something. As I said, there is an innocence implied here, which, as we look through some of these other pictures, you know, you'll see that particularly in this card. This is the Golden Dawn Tarot's depiction of the Fool. It's very, very different. This focuses in on the innocence and the concept of beginnings, birth. You know, you can see what we have here is a baby, but the baby is nestled against a wolf. And actually, if you look at the background is full of flowers, specifically roses. Now, the rose is a flower of very great beauty, but it's also a flower of peril, in that, you know, with roses come thorns. And you see that peril here. The peril is the cliff edge. You know, we step out into new experience, but, you know, every time we take that step, every time we take that leap, we take a risk. You know, life brings risks, just being brings risks, and you can see that very closely here. Waite also talks about the mystical Fool. So the Fool, if you think in those terms, is a symbol of not just of the sort of realities that we see around us, but also of the unseen realities. You know, you could think of this as much of a spiritual quest as a physical one. You know, when we embrace life, we embrace the things that we understand, but we also open ourselves to the things we don't understand. So maybe you could, I mean, the magic wand, you know, the pole with the satchel on, you know, the great wand, the magical staff. You know, maybe that's a tool of potential too. You know, I don't think the inference is that, you know, this is an innocent fool, but maybe, you know, in many quests, you know, the hero of the quest is given mystical gifts along the way that he doesn't necessarily understand, you know, their full usage or potential until he's faced with the need to use them. The white rose in his hand would tend to sort of bear that out. The rose is a flower of passion. So, you know, his passionate lust for life and experience is denoted here. But then it's the fact that it's white is also a symbol of purity and innocence. So there is, but then that's a theme that we've seen time and time again, you know, that clash between passion and purity, between passion and innocence. You know, it's a recurring theme through this deck. So there are other aspects to the Fool, which I'm going to show you some other depictions from other decks that will give you an idea of those other aspects. The Thoth deck Fool is fascinating because we are again into the realms of the mystical Fool, but then this is something much wilder. You can see he's green, so Crowley in his symbolism equates the Fool to the green man of spring. He also has horns, if you can see there. Now, this is equating him to gods like Pan, Dionysus, gods of abandon, gods of merrymaking, of, you know, gods of drinking, you know, gods of sexual excess. There is this lust for life very much depicted here. Interestingly, you see parallels with the Waitsmith in that, whereas the Waitsmith has a dog leaping at the Fool's feet, the Fool here is being bitten by a tiger. So, again, something similar. The Fool here has already leapt over the abyss. You can see him legs wide. You can see the abyss behind him. The danger is also signified by a lurking crocodile, which I think is an interesting depiction. Lots of other mystical symbols in here that I could take ages you know, analysing and going through, but maybe that's for another course. Beautiful, but very, very enigmatic image. Now, we've looked at the joyous aspects of the Fool, we've looked at the innocent aspects of the Fool, we've looked at the abandoned aspects of the Fool. There is another aspect, and this shows very much in some of the older decks. The Fool in the older decks is depicted very literally as the court fool, or the court jester, or even the madman. Now, there is a very powerful message here. Let's have a look at one of the very earliest depictions of the Fool. This is from a deck called the Visconti Sforza Tarot. It's one of the earliest surviving almost intact tarots. Painted for a noble family. These were hand-painted, hand-gilded cards, very expensive items. In the days before mass production of card games was possible through woodblock printing. Now, look at this Fool. Interestingly, even at this early stage, the Fool was shown on the edge of an abyss. Now, this is seemingly a mad beggar. The feathers in his hair denote madness. Look also, the staff is across the shoulder in the way that we see in Waite's deck. So there is even an early precedent, a 15th century precedent for that iconography. Now, with a madman, mad people back in those times when you think about life, life is about diplomacy. Life is about speaking the truth when it's appropriate, keeping quiet when it's not. That wasn't expected of mad people. Mad people, people suffering from madness, those boundaries would be removed. So we've all come across people who, think in modern day terms. Now this is not to equate autism with madness, quite the reverse. Autism is a completely different condition, but think maybe of somebody on the autistic spectrum who will speak the truth in a very bold way without consideration for boundaries or appropriateness in the way that somebody who isn't on the spectrum would do. Think a child who has yet to learn those boundaries. Think of somebody maybe suffering with one of the sort of conditions such as dementia. We don't expect that kind of thing from people in those states. The truth will come out, whether it's appropriate or not, or whether it's comfortable or not. This is what's depicted here. The fool as the madman, basically speaking truth without boundary. A very uncomfortable and potentially dangerous figure. Now, we see that developed on when we go to the sort of collection of decks known as the Marseille Tarots, basically originating in France, produced by all sorts of different card makers, obviously with a common iconography. And we see here, you can see Waite's dog is already in evidence here, snapping at the fool's leg, actually tearing his breeches. Now, this depiction is very much more like the court jester. You can see from the hat, the costume. We see the pole and the knapsack already here. Maybe not explicitly a magic wand, as Waite says. Now, if we think to the court jester was the only person in a court who had immunity to tell the truth, a very, very important role. Think of a king and a sort of medieval kingship. You are talking a totalitarian ruler. What they say is law, is decree. Kingship is not democracy in the way that we understand it now. So, in effect, you have autocratic rule. An inability to speak the truth, whether it's by the people or courtiers, in situations like that can lead up, can lead to a huge build-up of tension, resentment, opposition. And many kings recognise this, and the role of the fool within their court was a very important one, because the fool could tell the truth in very uncomfortable ways. The fool could speak the truth uncomfortably in a public way, but it was done as a jest. It was done in a subversive way. And the fact that it was done with jest and sarcasm, it went under the radar on one level, but actually it diffused tension on others. The fool was the one person who could speak the truth on behalf of everyone else with impunity. The fact that he turned it into a joke, he turned it into sarcasm, sanitized it in a way. But truth is at the centre of this figure, dangerous truth. The fool would put himself in peril's way in a way that nobody else would dare to. Something else to be considered. This is an interesting depiction. This one does show him as the court jester. This is from a 19th century Swiss deck. What we now know as the Swiss 1JJ Tarot. Now, this is just a much simpler depiction. It doesn't show the abyss. He's holding his wand in one hand. Actually, is it a wand? It's difficult to say. But Look at his hand gesture. In popular culture today, we see that a lot at rock concerts. It kind of has a slang connotation of rock on. In Mediterranean Europe, and certainly at the time this card would have been devised, it had a very, very different meaning. This was the sign of the bull. Now, if you made this to another man, it was a major insult because you were implying that their wife was committing adultery behind their back. So what the fool is actually doing here is gesturing obscenely to the king that the queen is committing adultery. Now, when you think of the implications of this, if any other person tried to do that to the king, they would probably be beheaded. You know, the fool is in a very dangerous but safe position. So, if we think about that along with this, what have we got? Perilously skirting the edge of the cliff, stepping out into the unknown, you know, leaping over the edge, risk-taking, truth, you know, truth that can be innocent or knowing. So maybe if we think of this card in the upright, this is an innocent fool. In the reverse, maybe taking his shadow aspect, this is not so innocent a figure, but one that actually speaks out, but in a way that nobody can touch him. What else can we say? Yeah, an impetuous figure, a truth sayer, a wild card. You know, he's 0 in modern decks. He's unnumbered in earlier decks. So if you think of the Major Arcana as a sequence, what we're actually going to be watching is the Fool journeying through that sequence on some levels. He can also weave his way in and out of those cards, pop up at any time, subvert them, turn them upside down, you know. He's very much, you know, on a positive level, he's very much the leap of faith and the new beginning. On another level, he's the subversion of the old order and tipping it upside down, questioning it, finger pointing at it, insulting it, you know. Very important figure because he actually gets us to look at the world in a different way, but truth underlines this card, whatever we do. So it's a card of truth, it's a card of new beginnings, it's a card of wonderful disruption, you know. I think that's all we can say about him. I think what we've said actually encompasses both his upright, his reversed, his positive and his negative aspects. Whenever this card appears, it is a card of peril for good or for ill, you know, and it is very much a card that denotes that beyond our control we're stepping into new territory that will engender risk for us, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Whatever the case, when the Fool appears, our existence is about to get much larger and the world is going to be a much larger place for us, or even an unfamiliar place that we've never explored before. Okay. Let's move on from the Fool to card number 1, the Magician. And here we are in the Rider-Waite deck. We see an esoteric magician. I would say that actually what we're seeing here is ritual magic. On his table are the 4 tools of ritual magic, and also the emblems of the 4 suits in the tarot. We have the pentacle, the sword, the wand and the cup. Interesting, his robes are mirroring the colours of the flowers he's surrounded by. White lilies for purity of intention, red roses for passion. You can see he wears a white vestment, but his outer cloak is red. Interestingly, round his waist, if you look closely, his belt is shaped like the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail. So actually around his waist is a symbol of infinity. Above his head is another symbol of infinity, the figure of 8 on its side, the lemniscate, a mathematical symbol of infinity. So in his right hand he's raising a wand to the sky, and his left hand is pointing down to the earth. Now this is a classic pose in ritual magic, in that it's a channeling posture. The wand is reaching up to the sky to touch sort of divine energy, and he's acting as a conduit to channel that magic transformative energy down to the earthly realm. So what can we say about him? Particularly if we look at him in tandem with the Fool. To answer that question, we actually have to look at some of the other earlier depictions as well. Waite takes a very mystical view of the magician in the way that he did the Fool. When we look at some of the early decks, we see perhaps a more earthy view, which ties in with some of the dark side of this figure as well. So I'm going to start with the Visconti deck. Now what we see here is not a sort of magical, high, mystical magician. We see a common fairground trickster. Basically this is how a conjurer or a juggler in a medieval fair would have been dressed. On his table we don't see magical ritual symbols, we basically see the tools of the conjuring act. So on the face of it this would appear to be a very, very different figure. I think these are probably more complementary than we realise. What he deals with is illusion. Okay? Now, this figure is dealing with the unseen. Upright, we have integrity, and we have channeling divine and unseen energy for good purposes. We have honesty in magical ritual. Turn him upside down, maybe we get something a little nearer to this petty figure here, you know. This is channeling energy for maybe not so, not so honourable reasons. This is, you're into the realms of black magic maybe. You are also into the realms of deception and trickery. Upright, there is honesty. Deception and trickery in the reverse. So, this figure, is his trickery just to entertain, or is it to defraud? Is the question. You see a similar figure in the French Marseille decks. Again, when you look at his table very closely, there are dice, there are cups, there looks like a couple of knives, there's a bag of magic tricks. He's got his wand in his hand, so the wand is there. Interestingly, the posture is nearer to this. The wand is raised in the air. But in these decks, we now see titles and numbers. He is numbered 1. The title in this deck, Le Battleur in French, the juggler or the trickster or the conjurer. Okay. Similar picture again in the Swiss 1JJ deck. Not very different, to be quite honest. It's only when we get into the 19th and the early 20th centuries that the tarot meets ritual magic and becomes a tool of magical, mystical meditation. Magicians actually take the symbols of the tarot and they enhance them, they augment them. And with this representation of the Golden Dawn, we can see something that is getting closer to, let me see, the camera's not focusing on that very well. Hopefully you can see it. Something that's getting closer to this. We can see now the symbols of ritual magic on the table. This magician is crowned with the lemniscate. Closer to this. So, let's have a look at the Thoth picture of the magician. Again, very similar to the Golden Dawn depiction. Crowley goes one step further. He actually uses the term magus, which really does set him apart as a practitioner of high magic. The His tools are floating around him. So yeah, this is a really sort of omnipotent magician, really, Ormagus. Very powerful. So how can we reconcile those two figures? The common trickster, the high magician. They both deal with the unseen in different ways. You know, the trickster deals with illusion. The magician or the magus deals with unseen, untapped, hidden divine energies that he channels down, that he manifests. Now, manifestation is, I would say, the key to this card. If you think of the Fool as the innocent, the truth speaker, the Fool basically has a lust to experience life. What you're dealing with the Fool is basically life in its straightforward form. You know, truth is basic. The existence of the material world is something basic. The Fool isn't seeking to alter those things. He's speaking to either experience them or speak them. Now, we've moved forward with the magician. The magician or the conjurer, they are seeking to transform or manipulate reality. So actually, you're into the realms of the unseen, but you're also into the realms of possibilities rather than just straightforward existence. You're into the realms of potential. So when he appears, I would say this card actually, if you were viewing the Major Arcana as a journey, this card represents that progression forward from being able to taste and experience the truth of reality to this step, which is to begin to engage with it, to seek to change it, to seek to influence it, for good or for ill. Again, in his positive aspect, you know, that process is for good. You know, if we reverse him, if we look at his dark aspect, maybe not so. Maybe the motives are questionable. Maybe this figure is not quite truthful. He's concealing as much as he's revealing. Another concept. But yeah, the principle of transformation. And with the Fool, the principle of being and becoming. So, I hope that's been helpful. Those are the first two cards of the Major Arcana. The next two cards that we'll be dealing with in the next lesson are the High Priestess and the Empress, the first two feminine figures in the Major Arcana. So I look forward to seeing you next time. If you've enjoyed this lesson and found it helpful, please hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel to find out when I share new videos or go live. You can also find me on Instagram at Chris Butler Artist, on Twitter at Butler Tarot, and on Facebook at The Sacred Tarot. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.